One of my favorite things about both this day, Holy Cross Day, and the name of this church is that it's on the cross where we truly see who God is and what God is like. Now that might seem a little odd because there's so many places that we see who God is and what God is like. I mean, God created the whole world. He is all-powerful. He knows and he sees everything. You'd think we'd get to know God through these things, these big things of God. But even though God does show himself in these big things, in the miracles and the shows of his power, that doesn't really show God's core identity. Because the core of God's being, everything God is about, is love. And nowhere is God's love expressed more clearly than what God did on the cross. I mean, there's probably any number of ways that God could have dealt with sin, right? If God has to do anything one way, then he's not really God anymore. There's bound to have been other options. But the option that God chose is the most personal one. Out of love for humanity, God in the person of Jesus left heaven for a time and became one of us, suffering death on the cross because that would rescue us from sin and death. This gets spelled out in John chapter 3 when Jesus is having a chat with a Pharisee named Nicodemus, saying that God loved the world so much that he sent his son so that all who put their trust in him will be saved. It's shown in Philippians chapter 2 when Paul gives Christ's example to the Philippians as how to love one another. 1 John chapter 4 says that God in love sent Jesus to deal with our unloving sinfulness. But still on some level, it doesn't make sense. Our first part in the opening chapter of 1 Corinthians, which we read some of today, we see this paradox that we expect to see God in huge, powerful acts, showing God's glory and showing how big God is. But the place where we actually see God is in the humiliation of the cross. A kind of execution reserved for either the worst criminals or the lowest class of criminals. The cross was meant to be a deterrent. It was less about the criminals dying and more about them suffering for long enough so that no one else does what they did. Crucifixion existed to say, don't do what this person did. And that is what God died on. How dare he? How dare God lower himself to death on the cross? And I think that question is exactly why God did it. Our human expectations of what God is often, well, it boils down to a heavenly vending machine. We put in our prayers and we get out what we want. That's how we too often see God, but that's not God. God is someone who loves enough that Jesus died on a cross. By going to the cross, by enduring all of the humiliation that entailed, it showed God's self-giving love. For those who don't cling to the cross, it doesn't make sense. Why venerate this object of death? But for us, we cling to the cross because that is where we see the true nature of God. We wear crosses around our necks as a reminder that on that cross, God's love flowed into the world through Jesus' blood. And of course, as we celebrate the cross, we cannot forget that Jesus didn't stay on the cross. He rose again. Because as we celebrate the cross as the manifestation of God's love, death could not contain him. By rising from the grave, the cross became more than just a tool of execution. It became the symbol of our victory in Christ. And all of it, the resurrection, his death on the cross, points to the love of God that he has for all of us. But there's more. When Jesus announces to his disciples that he's going to Jerusalem to die on that cross, he also tells them something else. Anyone who wants to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now, I've always heard this, and I'm mostly sure I've preached it, saying that means that we need to live for God and not be worried about our own lives because we're living for God. It means dying to ourselves and living for God, taking our cross, being ready to be martyred if that's what it takes. But if the cross is how we see God's self-giving love, and Jesus taking the cross is the ultimate expression of self-giving love, what if it's not so much taking up our cross and going to our own deaths, but taking up our cross, living out the same self-giving love that Jesus showed on the cross? What if Jesus' command here isn't so much about standing up for our faith, but about willing to go as far as possible, even if it means our own death, to love our neighbor? It's a little bit different take on taking up our cross and following Jesus, but if the cross is God's love for us, it changes his call a little bit, doesn't it? What if it means putting our lives on the line for people out of love, even if it's people that we consider our enemy? Paul writes in Romans 5 that Christ died for us even though we were still sinners, and God reconciled us to him even though we were his enemies. When Jesus took up his cross, that's what he did. He showed love to us even while we were his enemies. It's a radical kind of love, but it's the kind of love that Jesus lived on the cross. So how can we take up our cross and show God's self-giving love to the people around us? Or maybe it's a better question to ask, why do we so often leave our cross behind and not show love to the people around us? How often do we get in the way of God's love? Because we claim to follow a God who died out of love for us. We claim to follow a God who loves the whole world, even those who are actively against him, to the point that in order to save humans from sin and death, he chose the path of suffering for love. So I think when Jesus calls us to take up our cross and follow him, we are to live out love, God's love, even the kind of love that leads to a cross. So let's take up our crosses. As followers of Jesus, let's go out from this place with our cross to love people. To love especially those people who we might even consider our enemy. Because that's what Jesus did on the cross. That's what we're celebrating today. And that's our response as disciples of Jesus. If we want to go after him, we take up our cross. We take up God's self-giving love and follow his path of loving service to those around us, showing the love of God as we have been loved by God.